So I see most of us are not so much into philosophy, a little bit, but we are not philosophers. So would it be fine if some language and some maybe complicated terms could be
You mean
explained?
watch the language?
Yeah,
Okay.
or maybe just we welcome audience to ask if something is not clear. Yeah?
Yeah.
Cool?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for this generous introduction. So yeah, I'll just say that it will be easier if you would just, stop me and ask something, whatever comes to your mind, because I know how complicated things can get if you go too far into philosophy, and I have to watch my language, and it's been quite a challenge to actually prepare a material for such a topic. And it's not the first time I'm trying to do that. The first time I did it, I felt like there's just such a huge task in front of me that it's almost unrealizable. It's just too much of everything. It's just too much of concepts and ideas, and I feel like each of those ideas should be introduced somehow, which means time is going to run out. You're not going to be able to do that. So I was wondering how to do that. What's going to be the most suitable format? So it's just let's turn it into some sort of a workshop format. If you have some sort of a question, please don't hesitate to ask. Just because just raise your hand or whatever. Just interrupt. So I suppose you've been following something, somewhere in art and contemporary culture theory or philosophy. You probably heard about this notion of speculative realism, I suppose, right? Let's look into that. Let's just look into that. And what I'm actually offering, I'm not offering some sort of an insider's introduction from, I'm not a speculative realist myself, although I had some trouble trying to explain people what I do, because they automatically assume that you're probably one of them, which is it's not true. I'm not. But what interests me is the very emergence of speculative realism as speculative realism. So it's the conditions that this theme, this trend, or way of thinking or philosophy emerged. So my talk, I decided to divide it into simple subsections. So I'll give a brief contextualizing account on speculative realism, and then I'll just divide it into two, like what is speculation and what is realism, and why the combination of the two is such an explosive, why it causes so many problems to many people in academia. And then I'll try to touch a bit upon the question of speculative realism and art. What's the, relation? What are the resonances there? And I'll try to hint on some problems that speculative realism has or identifies, because speculative realism actually it's quite they're not some sort of naive philosophers that just march in and say, well, the real world exists there, no problem. If you have problems with that, just keep quiet. No, they're quite self-conscious, and they understand what kind of challenge they're facing. So they themselves anticipate a lot of problems with their own movement. But what is more important is what kind of problems non-speculative realists see in them, in this doctrine. So, Deleuze, in Negotiations, formulated an important idea about the relation between concepts and problems. He said something that is really underappreciated in philosophy and in academia as such. He said, philosophers introduce new concepts, they explain them, but they don't tell us, not completely anyway, the problems to which those concepts are a response. So the history of philosophy, rather than repeating what a philosopher says, has to say what he must have taken for granted, what he didn't say, but is nonetheless present in what he did say. In other words, if you are introducing some sort of a concept, let's say speculative realism, or any of the speculative realism concepts that go with it, for example, like correlationism, the anxiety that comes from the traditional, shall we say, part is, what is the problem that this concept responds to? What is this? Why this attention to realism? What's the big deal? As if the real didn't exist before, as if we didn't have tools or conceptual tools to address the real. So this is, I guess, the main problem of this talk, and the main problem that drives the inquiry. So it's been floating for quite a while in academia, this term, in blogosphere, in contemporary art world for some time, and but for some it might seem that speculative realism is some sort of a synonym with a zeitgeist or avant-garde movement, but for others, and I mean many others in philosophy and academia, it's merely a signifier of some sort of a fashionable trend, that's built its momentum on philosophically shaky grounds. So whatever the popular status of speculative realism were, so many philosophers, after having read a bit of Graham Harman, Quentin Mesu, they consider this kind of realism as unworthy of a serious consideration, and they undermine the debates by, simply withdrawing from them. They keep quiet. And this position in philosophy has been already there. I mean, the discussion between the debates between realists and non-realists, it's something that's been happening in philosophy in an analytic tradition already. So there's a stance towards this debate that has the name of quietism, right? So you keep quiet because you understand that it's just metaphysically, it's not going to produce anything of value because it's impossible to arrive at some sort of a point because it's just useless to debate on that. So in many ways, I can see that this is often a response. So despite of the huge popularity in some circles, in contemporary art, especially in architecture, in culture theory, maybe among the younger, generations, despite of this kind of a feeling that it's something is in the air, something is like happening, you have an enormous silence from well, someone who was working with 20th century philosophy, for example. He would say something like I spoke with several of academics, and they would say, I asked them, so what do you think about, well, Mesu or some speculative realism? They would say something like, but it's just, nah. It's a lack of words. It's just a lack of engagement. There's not much to say because, well, what can I say? So it's interesting. If you're from a metaphilosophical perspective, or from maybe from the perspective of sociology or philosophy, it's an interesting thing. Why would you? It's obviously a problem, so it can be addressed as a problem. The question is how, who is going to do it, and so forth. So you keep quiet. Or you can also engage with the arguments, and this is what a lot of academics have been doing. So they take the argument seriously, or even flirt with speculative realism, and that's. In my view, it's happening a lot, especially if you're like in your you're just like starting as an academic. You have some sort of there's just this task of diving into the tradition and dealing with the legacy in 20th century philosophy. But at the same time, you feel like you must have your own voice. So where's this voice is gonna, what are you gonna base it on? So, and you see how vigorous this movement actually is. So it's hard not to lay your eye on what's going on there. And obviously you read them. You read. For example, Mesu, and everyone's like waving with this little book after finitude, and you can get the sense of some sort of ambiguity. On one hand, you just reject it. You don't have much to say because, well, as an academic, you must have some sort of a program, some sort of a methodology of an approach. But there's no such methodology yet. It's just too fresh and too bombastically explosive, all those ideas. So and there are a lot of aspects that if you decide to engage with speculative realism, you can pick on many aspects. And on one hand, you can pick on how they construct their arguments and especially interpret classical texts. So you just, if you happen to be a scholar of, say, I don't know, German idealism or phenomenology or some, I don't know, Whitehead, Deleuze, your Deleuze, you see what they're doing with Deleuze, and this is how you engage with them. So there's a huge chunk of work that's been done like that, like in this way. So you have like a bunch of Deleuzians who are in a way flirting with this movement. They're trying to take the arguments seriously and try to undermine them, or try to, I don't know, it really depends, but this is one of the strategies. Another strategy is you can regard, as I said before, speculative realism as some sort of a suspicious phenomenon, as some sort of a symptom of something that remains yet to be revealed or demonstrated. What I mean by that is you can be suspicious of the very conditions of, emergence of this speculative realism as a trend, as some sort of a way of thinking, behaving, identifying yourself with philosophy. So you get suspicious. And this strategy, it comes from thinkers usually they come from the so-called critical tradition, and this is also something they relate themselves often with what Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher, called a school of suspicion. So you get suspicious about things, right? So he assigns, usually it's known, he assigns Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud as the key representatives of this, school of suspicion, and you get a lot. You have a lot of references to this kind of thinking, suspicious references to this kind of tradition from those who approach speculative realism with distrust, with suspicion. So one of the most interesting examples of this kind of approach is Alexander Galloway. He is, I'm going to go back to him. Yeah, sure, yeah. So I guess Alexander Galloway would be an important... So I'm going to get back to this guy later. So actually, indeed, there is something suspicious in how quickly speculative realism was assimilated into contemporary art. But I'm going to return to this later a bit. Why this suspicion? Why would a philosopher or an academic would be suspicious of some sort of a quick emergence of something, like brief and really quick coming into being of something and becoming popular? Primarily because those who do philosophy or something like that, they know that it takes time. I mean, it takes time to deal with all those texts and weird terminology. You have to read a lot, and you have to kind of produce the results. So it takes time, but it appears that today there's simply no time. We have no time to think what, those elaborations mean, nor do we have patience to decipher, this whole theoretical cryptology, because we need to figure out how to adapt to and be productive in the conditions of some sort of an acceleration, accelerating and self-reinventing capitalism. And it is true, so a worker of acceleration has no time to think, so there's no time. And the discourse, so it seems, as well as thinking itself, needs to be urgent, available, universal, global, realistic, simple, available. Especially when there's a perfect excuse, everything changes so quickly that once you start thinking about something, it's already too late. It's like too late. It's the problem of periodization. We're still pondering about postmodernism, and and there are many people who would say, it's passé. It's think about alter modern or meta-modernism or Anthropocene or post-Anthropocene or accelerationism. There's this pressure of to identify with a certain period and be aware historically in terms of periodization. So there's this feeling of acceleration. So how do we find ourselves in this whole pressure, in this while we face such a speed. It appears that, and this is one of my points, that perhaps speculative realism offers itself as some sort of a response to this urgency to be, well, global, realistic, available, maybe simple in some respects. I'm not saying that their writings are simple. So it's important to know that speculative realism emerged in blogosphere. You know, it was propelled by those various online publishing platforms that skipped time-consuming bureaucracies of academic publishing in peer-reviewed international, journals. It's a time-consuming thing, to publish. You just submit your article, you wait for it to be, accepted, usually rejected. And it's a really time-consuming thing, but suddenly you have a realization that, hey, we're all connected. And indeed, so it's interesting to know that, at least at the initial stages of the development of this movement, most of the discussions and the content production and publishing was happening without speculative realists actually seeing each other in real life, IRL, in real life. They haven't, it was all virtual. So it started in 2007 as a collective voice. There were quite a few, not so many of them, just a handful. They produced there was this conference in Goldsmiths College. Everybody knows about that, so it's like no need to dwell on this. And they produced this publication. It's like an edited book that it's pretty. Everyone who's interested in that, I really suggest you to look into that, because it has. It introduces the notion, it criticizes itself, and it invites others to criticize it. So you have some sort of a really vulnerable introduction. They say, okay, so shoot me. So they're really open to some, critique, and you have like Zizek, someone who's not a speculative realist, and others who engage with the ideas. Zizek, not many of those from Alain Badiou. Alain Badiou, of course, is not speculative realist, but he produced one of the main suspects, right? Quentin Meillassoux was his disciple. So, the speculative term so when looking at this movement from a distance of another discipline, such as art, for example, it might seem that this speculative realism found a way to tap into the power of beyondness. So you hear that a lot, beyond. So you hear going beyond the so-called linguistic turn in philosophy, in the 20th century philosophy, European philosophy, going beyond language. We're no longer bound by linguistic reductions and so on. So language is, you can go beyond it. Going beyond discursive practices as such, and most importantly, going beyond human finitude, right? So this beyondness, and it does seem that this going beyond, sort of a pressure to abandon something that is really obvious. It's been with us, and it's going to be with us seemingly. How can you abandon language, right? So it kind of expresses some sort of a really new self-fulfilling desire to move on. You just move on. You leave all that stuff, everything that gives you so many headaches, Kant, all those volumes, and break with the tradition. So another point is this breaking with the tradition point. I'm going to return to that as well. So for now, I'll try to be brief about the tradition that they're, assumingly trying to break with. So this tradition is what's called critical tradition in philosophy. So it's known because in response to David Hume's skepticism, you might probably know, Kant wrote his critique of pure reason, and what happened there basically set the whole coordinates for a couple of hundred years, and people are still dealing with something that happened there and then. To put it short, Hume created a huge problem for anyone who wanted to do science or know something objectively. He said, if you really think about stuff, you just realize that you have no reason to believe that the laws of nature will be there tomorrow. There's no guarantee anywhere that this pen will fall if I'll push it, tomorrow. If it's gonna, he wrote a fascinating book on that, and it's really accessible if you read it. And it's amazing how accessible it still is today. And it's no wonder that Quentin Meillassoux, one of the central figures in speculative realism, picked up David Hume as a starting point. He said, I don't believe that we're through with David Hume's problem. So David Hume's problem is that, the laws of nature, why would they, we're not sure why everything is so stable. We're not, there's no guarantee anywhere. But it's important that it was before Kant. Kant was horrified by that. Kant said, okay, so we need to, let's put some order in. So what he did, I'm reducing everything really, take it easy, on me. He drew a line between the phenomenal and the noumenal, which means the world is only what we experience, us, and the rest, which is the real, which is the thing in itself, as it is. But it's not, we don't know what that thing is, because all we can do is deal with our own ideas and our own feelings and our own senses. This is what he called a transcendental condition. There's no way you can actually access directly. There's no direct access to the world. He said, yes, the real world, the real thing is there, but the thing is that we cannot know it. We can suspect that it's there. Something is causing our sensations. They're coming from somewhere, but we cannot say anything about the real thing. So this is the debate that Kant was pretty sure he settled the debate. He said, and people are still sure that it's pretty much settled, this debate between the realists and non-realists. Kant said, yeah, sure, the real world exists, but we can only think about it, but not know anything about it. And he called this ponderation about something that you don't know, for example, the real world, a speculation. You speculate. To speculate means to observe from a distance. You know, if you look at the etymology of the word, it's imagine yourself standing on some sort of a hill or a watchtower, and you observe the terrain. You're not in the terrain, but you're on a watchtower, and you're giving an account on everything that you see, and you say, this is the world, right? So this is the world. But the problem is that, of course, you don't take into account the fact that you're elevated somewhere. You're not immersed into the terrain. Once you descend and start dealing with whatever that is, a forest, you're no longer able to see this vast picture. So the speculation is nothing new, and by far it's nothing dangerous as such to philosophy. It's been with philosophy since Aristotle. So you have something like a split between theory and practice. So theory would be this visual component. This is the distancing. So speculative reason asks, what can I know? While practical reason asks, what to do? What is it for us to do? What should I do? Because we need to, it involves, we need to act. We need to do something. We need to make decisions. In particular circumstances, we need to participate. So whenever we speculate, the problem is that is the fact that I that I created some sort of an idea, does it make an effect on the world? For example, if I combine two ideas into one, does that make any difference? If I combine the idea of a man and an idea of a horse, and I produce an idea So what kind of, so this is the terrain of speculation. And it's, as I said, it's not something as such, speculation as such is not something that, creates problems for us. We live with speculation, and there's a lot of philosophy that's been done because of the speculative propositions being made, both regarding something that's external or far, about objects, and something that's really close, like our bodies and our psyches. So in psychoanalysis, for example, it's a really famous example of Freud dealing with speculation, because his speculative moment of glory was to introduce the principle of pleasure, the pleasure principle. It's an idea that is not grounded on anything. It's an athetical. It has no thesis or no grounding. It's just a supposition. So as a philosophical device, it's not new. So, especially if you think about something like German idealism, which came after Kant and which was called as speculative philosophy. So you have speculative philosophy already, which is not realist, right? In German idealism, in Hegel, in Schelling, for example, you will not find anything real or discussions about realism, things being real, or this anxiety about, what's beyond my mind. No, Hegel says everything is my mind. I think, I create myself, I position myself, I invent the world, and the world is at my command. So the speculative reason was never such a big and all-encompassing thing as, after Kant's famous and unrefutable, seemingly, split into something that you know about the world because you experience and you have ideas, and something that causes your experience, but you're never able to approach that thing directly. Yeah.
I don't know if it helps you. I'm just thinking about Kant.
Yeah.
And the fact that he talked about the thing in itself that you couldn't see.
Yeah.
But he still made a mistake, according to Mayor Ciucelis. He still talked about it, even though he didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
He said it couldn't manage to be the opposite of itself.
Yeah.
It had, so
Yeah.
in a way that was also a falling out with Kant.
Between Meilsu falling out with Kant.
Yes,
Yeah.
in that sense that Kant was talking about this thing, and then Meilsu said, well, you can't see it.
Yeah.
You don't know anything about it at all.
Yeah. So he actually did. Meilsu's project is basically a critique of Kant. As he realizes it, it's like really powerful critique, because he blames Kant of you produce this whole system, this huge system of knowledge, but what remains unthought in Kant's thought is that you position your initial statements on nothing. You ground all that on nothing. You just start with saying, okay, so this is how it is. This is the transcendental principle is there. The very statement about us being conditioned by transcendentality, that means conditioned by this mediation of our minds and senses, is not necessarily, irrefutable or immovable. It maybe what Meilsu says is that the givenness must be in something already. Your transcendentality needs to be somewhere. Right? So it has to be somewhere. But the problem is that we don't know how to talk about that something. You're not able to leave your body and see, have this out of the body experience, and in order to have some sort of a knowledge. So speculative realists, they're saying, of course we don't, and we can't, but perhaps it's time to rethink the power or the value of speculation. So this is the question. Is it about some sort of a new knowledge, which is not? Or is it about the change in value in terms of what speculation can do? So this is I guess we're witnessing that speculation is assigned an additional value. There's been a huge intensive, it's really intense now, the speculation. So this is, I guess, another point as well, the change in value. Because until then, speculation had we all kind of knew what speculation was. So after Kant, it seemed that all you can do in philosophy is this endless inquiry into the conditions of possibility of everything. So just whatever you talk about, you need to talk about some sort of a conditions of possibility, because there's no way for you to talk about stuff directly, the term I didn't use yet was metaphysics, something that's beyond physics, beyond nature, beyond physics, comes from Aristotle. The notion that, something grounds our reality. It's not limited to what you actually experience and so on. There must be something beyond it, some sort of a fundamental part, particles or something that causes everything, something that stands as some sort of the cause. So this is the terrain of metaphysics. And after Kant, it appeared that you cannot talk about some sort of a cause. You cannot talk about, like Leibniz did, about monads. What is a monad? It's just a speculation, right? So what's going on? You have to refute that. Of course, Leibniz, Passet, all those other philosophers who tried to introduce those some sort of esoteric metaphysical notions about something grounding the world were refuted. And the whole tradition of philosophy until now was about, you take a philosopher and you say, okay, so what is this, some sort of aren't you being metaphysical somewhere? Aha, there you are. You're being metaphysical here by saying this and that, because you are unconsciously maybe looking for some sort of the initial ground or theological, some sort of a reason for your philosophy or your knowledge, which is unaccountable for. You must account for, what you're saying. And if there's something that you are unable to account for, there is the problem. So this was kind of a work that's familiar, at least in continental philosophy. So, and now it's over. Well, it's not over, but it's challenged. Okay, so it's challenged. So, of course, another part, so brief introduction to speculation. Another component is the realism. Realism in philosophy is not a shocking thing as well. It's been with us for a long time, and you get that generic realism of analytic philosophy that just simply poses that, say a thing like A exists, an object, let's say it's a real object, and it has certain qualities. For example, H-ness or G-ness or F-ness, but these are qualities that are independent from your beliefs, independent from your linguistic practices and from your conceptual schemes. Whatever you are, however you think, in what language, it doesn't matter. There are qualities that are going to be there. So sort of if you have an object like a chair, there's always going to be some real chairness, right? Chair, something. So in pre-Kantian philosophy, it's known as the primary qualities. The primary qualities that are before us judging about an object. So that was a nice speculative structure. And of course, there are secondary qualities. Let's say K-ness, L-ness, or M-ness that belong to humans. This is our interpretation of those qualities, because we have a sensual apparatus that judges and engages with the real object. So this is a generic realism, but in philosophy it seems that it's been busy more in terms of refuting realism and rejecting it rather than keeping it afloat and justifying it. So unless you are some sort of positivist, it's been popular for a while, especially in English-speaking countries. You can, positivist, someone who would say, yes, the world exists. I can actually, this is real. Don't tell me anything, all this hubba jabba about me, not actually touching the table, I'm touching the table, this is a real table, or about something about, scientific approach being, just one of the other approaches, many approaches. No, it's the objective approach, so no problem. Positively, yes, the real world exists. So, for many reasons, it didn't hold long. So speculative realism, and this is where it gets hard. This is what I was afraid of, because I'm not going to be able to explain anything. I'm not going to be able to explain speculative realism as some sort of a unified voice, because it's far from a unified voice. It's not something that comes as a party, like a political party or something, of a unified, indoctrinated ideology. But there is something that unifies them. Not much now. And there wasn't much at the very beginning as well. In 2007 and a bit before that. So I guess one of the concepts is, when you conjoin speculation and realism, you can say, I can agree with Kant and many others. But the problem is that the world is not exhaustible by all that. Because we can go beyond this. Because we can speculate about the real object. We can. Don't be afraid of that, we can go further. So another thing is that by opposing this non-realism of the tradition, you have to kind of name this whole tradition as something, this whole approach that philosophy has been into. So the name is correlationism. This comes from Ieyasu. He coined the term. Correlation, that means relation between, being in the world, okay? Or a human and the world. Or a mind and the world. Or you can use Heideggerian Dasein, being there. Being a human being there. So this inability to escape this relation, inability to have each of those components separately from each other is correlationism. It's correlation. And it's in some ways a derogatory term. If you're a speculative realist, you say, no, it's just you're just a correlationist. It means you're unable to think, to posit or think things like humans and non-humans separately. So this is a huge problem and challenge. In many ways, you find that kind of challenge in philosophy already. And for example, Graham Harman, one of the other key figures in speculative realism, he calls himself a subjectalist. A subjectalist. This is interesting because he says he's a proponent of the so-called object-oriented ontology. He says, for me, everything is a subject. Of course, objects, yes, but let's just keep objects aside for a while. But what he's saying by that, he's saying that everything is a subject, not in the sense that I'm some sort of vitalist, or not in the sense that I'm saying everything is, is a repetition of my mind or something. No, he's saying that the way that an object, a real thing in itself, is unavailable to me as a human being, like Kant says, everything else is not available to everything else the same way. For example, this pen standing on this table, Harman would say something like, this is a subjective situation in terms of this pen actually not touching the table. it sounds bizarre, reminds some of the Eastern philosophy paradoxes and so on. But what he's actually saying that this object, as an object, has an accessible core, the real core, that cannot access the real core of this object, like a table. So they're touching each other only through their secondary qualities, like us humans are perceiving the world indirectly. So this is, well, I'm not sure if you would agree, completely, because it's he still kind of works. He's working on this. It changes a bit, but basically he kind of expands something that's been already there in philosophy as an idea. So this unavailability of the real. So he's just saying that, okay, it's not. A lot of philosophers had nailed it, like Kant, like Levinas, who was talking about the unavailability of the other. But he's saying you should not restrict it to humans. Everything else is unavailable to everything else the same way. So the question is, how do you know? Why? So this is the question, I guess. I'm not. Once you arrive at this point, it's either you, bounce like you're I don't know, it feels like you're approaching your mirror image, and you bounce away from the mirror, or you imagine that you go through and you just you're there in the mirror world, which is a different world. Yeah.
Like if he, Mesu, states himself, I believe that these things not touching each other.
Yeah.
How is that belief different from any other belief? Why should we carry on talking about that when we don't have any base for that?
Yeah, this is a good question. Why should we keep on talking about this? Well, because this is another point why I was kind of doing this presentation. Once we arrived at this point, I'm not going to go further into other speculative realists because there's just so many of them and they're really different. But basically, they all have the kind of edge, the same edge of this aporia, this paradox, this.
Thomas, we must know about, recent researches in brain physiology and things like that. Yes, I don't believe that they don't know what the scientific research is in quantum mechanics, for instance, or whatever. But for instance, let's do an experiment. In MRI machine, I can watch my brain working, but I can't see myself.
Yeah.
That's the problem. Working brains
Yeah.
producing electromagnetic waves, and those waves are actually symptoms of me.
Yeah.
So that's perhaps that there is something, I don't know. It's just actually here you have to make an experiment and how the philosophical, me can be involved in this experiment.
But the thing is that you can't see your thinking, or for example, you can't
I
see.
see because MRI machine shows me.
No,
It shows me thinking.
neurology is not thinking. It's just
So two problems here. One problem is that actually one of the problems that they admit as well is that it's not quite sure how the discussions about consciousness come in, in speculative realism, because you can talk about objects and real things, but what is consciousness then? Where it emerges from and so on. So this is the black spot.
Essential thing
So this is.
I wonder if maybe it might be helpful if you were to contrast some of what you've been saying about speculative realism with the 1970s movement's critical realism.
Yeah.
And perhaps maybe this might be something to help instead of dealing with a variety of different thinkers, maybe if another movement within the realist strain might be a way
as a contrast.
As a contrast, or the similarities that you might see between the two. As both within this field of stream of realist movements.
Yeah, well, actually, I was trying to arrive at one point in terms of this realism being some sort of a symptom of something that actually changed in terms of our world. Something has changed recently, and I mean cultural and technological conditions. So this is something that I suspect to be some sort of productive approach towards that. I'm still working on this. I guess I'm going to be focusing in my doctoral work, at least partly on that. But what I wanted to mention is this interesting relation between speculative realism and art. Because this is something that actually sparkled, resonated. It kind of, there were those stars, and electricity flowing. It was really interesting to see how they themselves, for example, Graham Harman was surprised by how artists picked up on object-oriented ontology, how quickly they did that. And he started receiving the invitations to talk, speak at the art academies more often than in philosophy symposia, So he said, okay, something's going on there, including some of the others, like Timothy Morton, but Timothy Morton is all out, but...
You just mentioned Tripolo. Could you say what's
Pardon?
the difference between speculative realism and Tripolo?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Just introduced.
Okay, yeah, so many people confuse speculative realism with object-oriented ontology. So Graham Harman says object-oriented ontology that he actually represents, and he coined this term, he works on this, is like it belongs to speculative realism. It's like a branch, although he claims he started working on this earlier than speculative realism came about. Okay, so he generously offered himself, he joined the party of speculative realism. But basically, what speculative realism encompasses is the whole variety of realisms and materialisms. Okay, so an object-oriented ontology is strictly realism, and Graham Harman is viciously strict and rigorous in terms of saying that I'm a realist, I'm not a materialist. There's a difference. You must be aware of that. Okay, there are many ways to explain what materialism is, but in terms of realism, he says a realist always posits the real object that you cannot actually access, and it exists there despite of you living, even, being there. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It was there before humanity, it's going to be there after humanity. So a materialist would say, yeah, the matter exists, but only as some sort of a result of some sort of contact with. So we can say there's a social materialism in terms of social relations being the real thing, the material thing, because I feel the friction when I'm engaged socially, so this is the only real thing, and so on. Or you can say, the materialism as some sort of a scientific materialism. You only you only trust in the matter that's been revealed through science. Okay, so this is the materialism. And Harman says, no, this is not for me. It's not. I don't need all those confirmations or contacts. I'm strictly non-relational. And this is his friendship with non-relation, the notion of non-relation. And in art, you have the concept of non-relational aesthetics that's been rising up currently. And you cannot just ignore those resonances between those two things. So my idea was to kind of hint towards this. Consider one moment. If you read all the speculative realists and object-oriented ontologists, you will miss something. Okay, if you're a conscious reader, or you had some culture, theory experience or whatever, you will notice a huge gap, which is usually the lack of any kind of political dimension. There's no politics in object-oriented ontology. There's no relation as such as in the first place. To which Harman replies, and he's been asked about that a lot of times, he says, well, yeah, of course I understand that. It's just that I just began working on this, and it's not yet. I'm not sure where I'm going with all that. So you don't need that situation when you have philosophy as a maid, as a servant to politics. He compares the situation to the situation in, say, medieval philosophy, when philosophy had to be a maid of religion. You do what you want, but only with one condition: there must be a God at the very top. Okay, so everything needs to be, to lead to God. So you have Descartes trying to, trying to do his philosophy, this massive project, by starting with God. Okay, so let's assume there's God, and you just start, work from there. But and Harman obviously wants to kind of distance himself from this, and it seems that it's a really pure speculative project. It's pure in terms of speculation. So you have this kind of ivory tower experience in a way of a philosopher, being in there. Although there's such a huge interest in this purity in art, and I stumbled upon a couple of people who are beginning to suspect that there's something going on there, and this is where some sort of productive approach can, begin. What they are actually saying is the following. For example, if you take one theoretician, Heindereich, he did some really interesting work on how speculative realism provides art with an ideological framework that benefits the current developments in contemporary markets, which is something really interesting. He talks about the phenomena of Freeportism. I don't know if you heard about that, but he talks about Freeports. sort of a new, really high-tech sort of storage spaces for artworks that store artworks. And no one can actually access those artworks. You are assigned a certain space, and you put whatever is of value there. It's like a bank, only without money and artworks instead of money. So you have that in Geneva, in Switzerland, quite a few of them. You have in some other countries, I guess Liechtenstein has that. So if you're sensitive to the political, dimension, you will notice that these are the countries that this is the tax haven, reference to tax haven, and it's related to. It's actually a solution. This kind of storage of artworks, it's a solution to a certain demand to manage value today. So you no longer have gold standard being assigned to money. You no longer have gold as the ultimate, value standard as such. But artworks, he says, is the domain where the value is purely speculative. And this value depends only on the limits of your capability to speculate. Because it's actually, true. So what happens in Geneva, for example? You have millions of items, millions. They have, in Geneva and Freeport has, I guess it's like a couple of 100 million bottles of wine. That much is known. And the rest of them are just like artworks. The collectioners, gallerists put them there. But what happens, what's the relation with speculative realism here? So he says that this speculative realism, and especially object-oriented ontology, because of its non-relationalism, is an ideological framework that supports, quote, the turn from discursive to material practices, from rituals to communication, from rituals of communication to objects on commodities, and from web-oriented and process-based artworks to shiny items provided in ample liquidity. The new brand of philosophical thinking called speculative realism offered itself as an ideology of Freeportism and its associated modes of artistic production and circulation, whether its appearance was a lucky coincidence or whether both post-internet art and speculative realism are symptoms of the very same economic and technological regime is open to discussion. However, both serve each other exceedingly well. So he just notes that this is, we should be aware about something, but I wanted to get to the point that he's talking about this new regime, technological and cultural regime, where art usually it acquires a virtual dimension. You have this networked reality where an artwork circulates in terms of descriptions, images, digital, in terms of digital content. And you have an object itself, which is an artwork, that causes those, this content, this whole networkable content, which is the main part of our experience. So his point is that we cannot just ignore the fact that the very thing that an artwork is adapts itself to what's going to happen to its own representations. And he's saying this is what post-internet art was doing. And this is something that post-internet art is doing. Because you are aware that this thing that you're creating as an artist is going to be distributed, is going to participate somewhere, is going to be made, there are going to be like a lot of copies of it made, and so on. So this is the real, or should I say material part of art. But at the same time, you have this real object somewhere, deep. Where is it? It's in the Freeport. You know? So I enjoyed really this kind of approach because this is the moment where speculation actually touches upon something, you know, without it wanting to touch upon something. Because there is a condition, there's a condition that, you know, we were not aware about this condition, and now we're able to establish a dialogue between the world and this speculative model. So I guess this evasion of politics and evasion of ethical dimension is really important because you don't confront, you don't risk, you don't go into, you know, contact in terms of, you know, when you're an artist, you can address many things, you know, but you talk about objects, and you talk about, like, you know, this metal plate touching this plastic cover, and this being an event on its own. Where's the rest of the world? What distributes this thing? Where does it go? How much does it cost? Why did you do that? Who made you do this? Who are you addressing? And so on. So what are those questions? So this is Heinrich. Another guy, and I'm going to be really brief here, is Alexander Galloway. His point of approach, he problematizes speculative realism in terms of, well, as I said, philosophy needs to be accountable, I quote him, to its own political and historical context, not remain separate from it, as some speculative realist authors maintain. So Galloway claims that speculative realists' accounts on reality reflect the modes of production of delayed capitalism or post-Fordism. So this is, I guess, one of the powerful critiques that I think is really usable. He is saying that you cannot just ignore the fact that, for example, object-oriented ontology reflects or mimics the latest mode of production today, which is the mode of production in there's a production of knowledge and the late capitalism, which is the digital production. So this is another point where you can actually start thinking about the parallel between object-oriented ontology and object-oriented programming, for example. And Alexander Galloway is a programmer. Initially, he wrote some books on the philosophy of code and that kind of stuff. And his point is that I'm not going to go too far on this. I'm just wrapping up. That the notion of object in programming, and you have a notion of object in philosophy. You know, they're resonant. There's a resonance between them. So, and he says, why within the current renaissance of research in continental philosophy is there a coincidence between the structure of ontological systems, object-oriented ontology, and the structure of the most highly evolved technologies of post-Fordist capitalism? In post-Fordist capitalism, if you still regard it as an ideology, there's some sort of a blind spot that needs to be maintained in order for capitalism to work. Okay, so all the critics of capitalism were usually trying to pinpoint that blank or black spot, that unaccounted spot, and liberate themselves from this ideology, from this narrative. So his point is that you cannot allow yourself to be like seductive in terms of giving in to this speculative realist agenda that, for example, non-relationality and being self-contained. I don't know, in this non-political, the world without political engagement, without ethical engagement, without economic concerns and so on. So this is his concern. This is his concern to be suspicious, and he says, well, this is my freedom to be suspicious. You cannot just say that I'm not. I'm not getting it or something, I'm getting it. The fact is that you cannot just posit such a pure speculative condition. I guess I'm too much into the details here. How much time have we got? Yeah, no time. Okay, so if you just have any questions or whatever, so yes, I'm just going to stop.